Welcome to Wisdom for the Present, where we take ancient truth and bring it into clear, modern understanding. This episode uses AI-generated narration based on human researched and written material. So imagine a society where burying a female infant alive isn't considered this horrific crime.
Right.
But it's actually just, a normalized, practical financial strategy.
Which is just wild to even think about today.
It's completely chilling. A society where the most powerful leaders are just entirely consumed by accumulating wealth, where status is literally everything, and the vulnerable are just routinely crushed under the wheels of commerce.
Yeah.
So the question is, how do you reform a culture that's not only comfortable with its own cruelty, but is actively profiting from it?
That is the exact problem this text is trying to solve.
Exactly. So today we're embarking on a deep dive into this profoundly disruptive sequence of ancient texts. Specifically, we're looking at the early Meccan chapters from the Qur'an, spanning chapters 78 through 102.
And, it is just a phenomenal stretch of literature. We're looking at a collection of chapters that are dense. They're highly poetic, and they are fiercely urgent.
Definitely.
They were delivered into a world that was entirely obsessed with hierarchy and leverage,
Right.
And they completely upended the foundational assumptions of that whole society.
And I want to set the parameters for our discussion right out of the gate here. Because whether you, the listener, are exploring these specific ancient texts for the very first time, or maybe you're intimately familiar with them, our objective today is laser-focused.
Right. We're not just doing a history lesson.
No, not at all. We aren't doing a dry historical autopsy today. We're looking to extract the practical wisdom, the moral insight, and honestly, the deeply uncomfortable challenges these verses present. We're asking how a message designed to shock a 7th century commercial hub might actually be speaking directly to our own modern financial districts or, our corporate ladders and even our personal relationships.
Yeah, and the historical context is really the only way into that understanding. To comprehend the medicine being administered in these chapters, you have to thoroughly understand the disease of the patient.
That makes total sense.
The society the author was addressing was not, it wasn't some sleepy, isolated, nomadic outpost. Early Mecca was a booming, cutthroat commercial center. It was essentially the Wall Street of the desert.
I think that's a really crucial misconception we need to clear up right away, because people hear 7th century Arabia and they picture, scattered tents and disconnected tribes.
Yeah, exactly.
But Mecca was a massive economic engine, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Its geography and its housing of the Kaaba made it this central hub for pilgrimage and consequently trade. So the society was dominated by the Quraysh tribe, and they basically held a virtual monopoly over this entire economic engine. You had deep, entrenched tribal allegiances, this fierce culture of capital accumulation, and just glaring systemic inequality. The elite were highly sophisticated in their trade networks. They were dealing with empires to the north and the south. They were cosmopolitan, wealthy, and honestly deeply arrogant about their position in the world.
Which brings us directly to the text itself. When we look at chapters like chapter 102, which is literally titled The Multiplication of Wealth, or chapter 89, The Daybreak, the critique leveled at these leaders is just blistering.
It really is.
And it doesn't critique them just for being wealthy. It critiques the psychology of their wealth.
Right. The language used is very, very specific. The text describes a culture consumed by devouring heritage indiscriminately and loving wealth exceedingly.
Okay, let's pause on that phrase. Devouring heritage indiscriminately. That sounds like a nice poetic flourish. But in practical terms, what did that actually look like on the ground for these people?
Well, in that specific socioeconomic structure, when a patriarch died, the inheritance didn't just automatically go to the widows or the orphans. The powerful men of the tribe, the guardians, would often just absorb that wealth right into their own estates.
You're kidding. They just took it.
They just took it.
Yeah.
And they justified it by claiming, only those who can ride into battle and defend the tribe deserve the wealth.
Wow.
Yeah, it was a system designed to consolidate power at the very top while systematically disenfranchising the most vulnerable. So devouring indiscriminately means they literally did not care who they stepped on to increase their margins.
So if we were to walk the streets of this ancient city today, obviously, the architecture and the clothing would be completely alien to us, but the underlying psychology would feel uncomfortably familiar.
So entirely.
That endless pursuit of more capital, more market share, more influence. Loving wealth exceedingly is not a phrase stuck in the 7th century. It is the driving ethos of modern hyper-capitalism.
Yeah, and the text recognizes that this isn't just some harmless, ambitious drive. The consequence of this unchecked obsession with status was deeply, deeply destructive to human life. Which brings us back to that stark reality of the infanticide you mentioned at the start.
Right.
Chapter 81 references the pre-Islamic practice of burying female infants alive.
It's just one of the most chilling verses I've ever read. The text says, "And when the one buried alive is asked for what sin she was killed, it forces you to just stop and process the absolute horror of it."
Yeah, it really stops you in your tracks.
But it does so in a very specific way. Notice it doesn't ask the murderer why he did it. It asks the victim.
And that is a profound rhetorical inversion. By giving the voiceless, marginalized victim the microphone on the ultimate day of judgment, the text completely strips the powerful of their voice. It highlights the absolute absurdity and cruelty of the act.
So powerful.
Historically, this practice was driven by a fear of poverty, this idea that a daughter would be an economic drain, or conversely, a twisted sense of patriarchal pride, a fear of eventual disgrace.
Which means human life was being subjected entirely to a cost-benefit analysis.
Exactly.
The child was seen as a liability on a balance sheet, so the liability was eliminated. When you frame it like that, you realize the urgent, revolutionary tone of these early chapters, it isn't abstract theology at all. It is a desperate cry for social reform.
It's a text looking at a society operating with profound imbalance, where human value is determined purely by economic utility. And it is demanding that the entire system just halt.
But here is the friction, right? How do you actually wake up a society that is completely comfortable with its own corruption?
It's incredibly difficult.
Right, because if I'm a wealthy leader of the Quraysh, the system is working perfectly, Shami. My wealth is growing, my status is secure, my tribe is dominant. If someone walks into the public square and tells me to share my wealth and stop exploiting the vulnerable, I'm just going to laugh at them. I mean, moral reasoning rarely works on someone whose livelihood depends on ignoring that reasoning.
Which is precisely why the text abandons polite moral debate. You cannot negotiate with a worldview that is that entrenched. You have to shatter its foundation. You have to induce a state of existential vertigo, really. And that is exactly what the text does through its intense use of cosmic apocalyptic imagery.
Let's get into that imagery because it is relentless. In chapter 78, the announcement, and chapter 81, the folding up, we are hit with these apocalyptic descriptions that just defy human comprehension.
They're overwhelming.
Yeah, the sun is folded up or covered, the stars darken and scatter, the mountains are made to pass away, the oceans boil over.
The heaven having its covering removed. It is a systematic deconstruction of the physical universe exactly as they knew it. Everything that represented permanence, stability, and navigation is completely dismantled.
I have to push back here, though, on behalf of the modern skeptical listener.
Sure, go for it.
Because in the 21st century, when we hear about heavens cleaving asunder, or we read in chapter 78 about a hell lying in wait with boiling and intensely cold water, our modern sensibilities immediately put up a wall.
Of course they do.
We tend to write this off as primitive scare tactics. The classic, obey the rules or the sky will fall and you will burn in agony trope. For a listener trying to extract practical wisdom today, it's hard not to view this as just an ancient mechanism for behavioral control. So why should a modern analytical mind engage with this kind of terrifying imagery?
It's a very fair critique, and it's one that requires careful discernment. If we take a purely superficial reading, yeah, it does sound like a medieval torture chamber used for coercion. But the linguistic roots and the textual commentaries suggest a much, much more sophisticated psychological and spiritual framework.
Okay, how so?
Look closely at chapter 78. The text explicitly states that the consequence is a requital corresponding.
A requital corresponding, meaning the punishment is an exact mirror of the crime.
Exactly. The text isn't describing an angry deity just randomly assigning arbitrary tortures. It is describing the natural, inevitable culmination of a corrupted soul. The punishment is the externalization of the internal state.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, for instance, the text addresses the inordinate, those who consistently exceed moral and ethical limits. And the Arabic word used for their consequence is gasak, which linguistically conveys an intense, unbearable, freezing darkness. And then it's paired with boiling water.
So it's the absolute extremes of temperature.
Yes. The underlying philosophy here is basically the thermodynamics of the soul. If a human being spends their entire life oscillating between the burning heat of unchecked greed and the freezing cold of absolute apathy toward the suffering of others, what is the ultimate state of that soul?
Wow.
The text argues that the soul eventually becomes trapped in the very environment it created. The boiling water and the freezing dark are not imposed from the outside. They are the architectural blueprint of the soul the person built while they were alive.
I see. That completely shifts the paradigm. It's less about a cosmic warden punishing you and more about the universe simply holding up a mirror and saying, this is what you have become. You wanted a reality built on ruthless extraction and cold indifference. Well, you get to live in it forever.
Precisely. And this concept of mirroring extends to the cosmic events as well. The commentary suggests we can read the darkening stars and the shattering mountains metaphorically.
Oh, really? Metaphorically?
Yeah, think about it. The Quraysh leaders looked at their societal structures, their trade routes, their alliances, their status.
Yeah.
They looked at those as immovable mountains. They looked at their prominent leaders as guiding stars.
So when the text says the mountains will pass away and become like a mirage, it's not just a geological prophecy, it's a political one.
It is prophesying the total collapse of seemingly unshakable power structures. The text is warning the elite, you think your power is permanent. You think your institutions will last forever. But in the grand scheme of cosmic time, they are a mirage. They will vanish in an instant.
Right.
The quaking of the earth represents a massive social revolution where the bottom of the hierarchy is brought to the top and the top is leveled into dust.
That translates so perfectly to the modern experience. I mean, we don't have to look back to the 7th century to understand the illusion of permanence. Think about the global disruptions we've experienced recently, economic crashes, global pandemic.
Absolutely.
Before those moments, we looked at our global supply chains, our economic systems, our daily routines, and we viewed them as mountains. They were permanent fixtures of reality. And then almost overnight, they were made to pass away. They felt exactly like a mirage.
The immense scale of the cosmos is utilized in these chapters to remind humanity of its extreme fragility. You cannot anchor your identity, your morality, or your soul to things that will eventually crumble. If your entire self-worth is tied up in a societal structure that can vanish in a week, you are in deep existential peril.
This begs a very uncomfortable thought experiment for you, the listener. I want you to examine your own life right now. Where are you operating under the illusion of permanence? What are the mountains in your life? Maybe it's your job title, your investment portfolio, your public reputation, the specific industry you work in. What have you convinced yourself is unshakable?
It's a tough question.
Because if the ground quaked tomorrow and those mountains were revealed to be shifting sand, what of you would actually remain? Who are you when the external structures of your life collapse?
And that is the exact introspective panic these chapters intend to induce. It is designed to strip away the false security of wealth and status. But once it shatters the illusion of this grand cosmic permanence of worldly power, the text does something brilliant.
What's that?
It zooms all the way in. It moves from the shattering of the universe down to the quiet, mundane, everyday transactions in the marketplace.
It goes from the macro to the micro. I love that. I want to look closely at chapter 83 for this, which is titled The Defaulters, or in Arabic, At-Tatfif. This chapter is so specific, it's almost surgical. The text says, woe to the defaulters, who, when they take the measure of their dues from men, take it fully, but when they measure out to others or weigh out for them, they are deficient.
The linguistic root here, mutafifin, is fascinating. It signifies someone who makes something defective, deficient, or trifling. It originally referred to merchants who would use two entirely different sets of weights.
Like literal weights on a scale.
Exactly. When they were buying grain from a farmer, they would use a heavier weight to ensure they got more than their fair share, taking their measure fully. But when they were selling that grain to a customer, they would subtly swap to a lighter weight, giving less than what was paid for.
A literal thumb on the scale. But obviously the critique here goes way beyond ancient agricultural commerce. This is a fundamental statement about human hypocrisy and the exploitation of leverage.
It is about the deeply ingrained human desire to construct double standards that always favor ourselves. The commentary highlights that this chapter condemns those who rigorously demand their full rights from society, but are utterly negligent regarding their duties to others.
Let's bring this into the modern corporate environment, because the modern equivalents of mutafifin are everywhere. Think about the massive multinational corporation that utilizes every single tax loophole, heavily lobbies for infrastructure they benefit from, and demands absolute protection under the law.
Right.
They take a massive full measure from the society they operate in, but when it comes time to measure out to their hourly workers, suddenly they are severely deficient. They nickel and dime benefits, they suppress wages, they fight against safe working conditions, they are institutional defaulters.
And we can see it in how algorithms and gig economies are structured today. Platforms that demand a high percentage of the revenue and total availability from the worker, but offer zero job security or healthcare in return. They are demanding the full measure of human labor while returning a severely deficient measure of human dignity.
But, it's too easy to just point the finger at big corporations.
For sure.
The text forces us to look in the mirror, because this applies deeply to our interpersonal lives, too. How often do we operate as defaulters in our marriages or our friendships or our families?
The psychology of the defaulter is insidious because it usually feels completely justified to the person doing it. We all have a narrative where we are the victim and therefore we're owed something.
Exactly. When I make a mistake, when I snap at a friend or I drop the ball on a project at work, I want the absolute full measure of grace. I expect people to understand my context, to know that I was tired, that I meant well. I demand complete empathy.
Right, you want the heavyweight used for yourself.
Yes. But the moment a colleague or a partner makes a mistake that inconveniences me, I pull out the strict, unforgiving scale. I judge them purely on their action, offering a completely deficient measure of grace. We want the rules to apply strictly to everyone else, but we demand exceptions for ourselves.
And the text is calling that out, not just as a character flaw, but as a profound moral failure that corrupts the soul. It is a form of spiritual theft. And what is vital to understand here is that the text doesn't merely diagnose the sickness of being a defaulter. It prescribes a very rigorous, demanding alternative.
Yes, the cure. In chapter 90, The City, the text contrasts the path of the defaulter with the path of the righteous. And it introduces a concept that I find incredibly compelling: the uphill road, or al-aqaba.
The terminology is crucial here. Al-aqaba signifies a steep, difficult, exhausting ascent. It immediately disabuses the listener of the notion that spiritual purity is a passive state of relaxation. Doing the right thing, breaking the habit of defaulting, is going to cause a lot of friction.
And what I appreciate is how explicitly the text defines this uphill road. Because if you ask a lot of modern spiritual traditions what the difficult path is, they might say it's achieving a complex state of mindfulness, or mastering a difficult yoga pose, or enduring a 30-day silent retreat.
Yeah, very internal things.
Exactly. Those things have value, but they are largely internal and individualistic. How does this text define the uphill road?
It defines it with radical, material social action. The text says the uphill road is the setting free of a slave, or the giving of food in a day of hunger to an orphan having relationship, or to the poor man lying in the dust.
The poor man lying in the dust. That is such a visceral, unignorable image. It doesn't say, contribute to a charity. It says, look at the human being who has been entirely discarded by society, the one literally in the dirt, and pull them up.
The commentary emphasizes that this constant repetition, freeing the slave, feeding the orphan, uplifting the destitute, it reveals the true character of this movement. It was never just a philosophical debate about theology. It was a tangible, materially demanding framework for justice. The uphill road requires you to expend your own resources, your own time, and your own capital to balance the scales for someone else.
There is a comparative insight here that is impossible to ignore. If you study the great wisdom traditions across human history, whether it's the teachings of Jesus regarding the least of these, or the Buddhist emphasis on active compassion, or even the Stoic concept of cosmopolitan duty to fellow humans, they almost all converge on this exact same truth.
They really do.
The ultimate, undeniable proof of your internal enlightenment is how you treat the most vulnerable, powerless person in your proximity.
It serves as the ultimate lie detector test for piety. You can pray for hours, you can meditate perfectly, you can memorize sacred texts, but if you walk past the man lying in the dust without your heart breaking and your hands moving to help, your spirituality is an illusion. It is a useless, private righteousness that serves only your own ego. True purification is inextricably tied to your neighbor's survival.
So let's ground this in a thought experiment for the listener today. First, I want you to critically examine your own interactions this week. Where are you acting as a defaulter? Where are you demanding a full measure of credit or patience or money while offering a deficient measure of effort, empathy, or compensation? Identify the double standard.
It's a hard mirror to look into.
It is. And second, look for your own uphill road. It is human nature to take the path of least resistance, which usually means networking with people who can help us and ignoring those who can't. This week, find an opportunity to expend your resources, your advocacy, or your time on someone who is in the dust. Someone who has absolutely zero capacity to repay you, advance your career, or boost your status. That friction you feel when doing it. That's the feeling of walking the uphill road.
It is incredibly challenging. And it's important to note that the text doesn't pretend this is easy for anyone, not even for the most revered leaders.
That's a great point.
We've talked about systemic greed and market fairness, but the text gets uncomfortably intimate when it looks at how the illusion of status infects interpersonal leadership.
This might be my absolute favorite part of the deep dive. We are talking about the historical incident recorded in chapter 80, which is titled He Frowned, or Abasa.
Yeah, this is a powerful one.
The context provided in the notes here is critical to understanding the weight of what actually happens. Let me set the scene. The prophet is engaged in a deep, highly sensitive, high-stakes conversation with the most wealthy, eminent leaders of the Quraysh tribe.
Right. He is trying to win over the influencers of his day. And from a purely strategic standpoint, it makes perfect sense. These are the men who control the economy, the politics, and the military power of Mecca. If he can convince them of his message, the persecution of his followers stops, and the movement gains massive, instantaneous legitimacy. He is employing utilitarian leadership, focusing on the highest leverage targets.
And right in the middle of this intense networking, a blind man approaches. He's a humble, existing follower of the message. He interrupts the conversation because he earnestly wants to be taught. He is seeking spiritual knowledge.
And the timing is terrible from a strategic perspective.
Exactly. And the prophet, who is completely dialed in to trying to convert these elite power brokers, is annoyed by the untimely interruption. He frowns, and he turns his back on the blind man to continue his conversation with the wealthy leaders.
It is such a profoundly human moment. You can completely understand the cognitive dissonance. In his mind, he is doing the right thing. He's thinking, I already have this blind man's allegiance. I need to focus on these elites because the survival of the community depends on it. This interruption is jeopardizing the mission.
Yeah.
He's prioritizing external power over internal purity.
But the text does not let him get away with that justification. The revelation that immediately follows this event, the verses that make up chapter 80, actively, fiercely, and publicly rebukes the prophet.
The text calls him out directly. It reads, he frowned and turned his back because there came to him the blind man. And what would make you know that he would purify himself?
And then it deconstructs his entire strategic approach. It says, as for him who considers himself free from need, to him do you address yourself. And as to him who comes to you striving hard, and he fears, from him will you divert yourself. It essentially asks, why are you chasing the arrogant people who think they have everything and ignoring the terrified, earnest person who is begging for your help?
This brings up a critical point of discernment regarding the text itself. Look at the remarkable transparency here. We have a document that claims divine origin being delivered through a specific messenger, and it permanently records a moment of that very messenger's moral failure.
That is wild to think about. I mean, if you were a cult leader or a powerful man inventing a religion to solidify your own legacy, the absolute last thing you would do is publish a chapter about the time you were an arrogant jerk to a disabled person.
Exactly. The commentary specifically notes this as evidence of the text's source originating outside the prophet's own inclinations. A man offering his own flawless legacy would have suppressed this incident immediately. But instead, it is given wide publicity and preserved for eternity. Why? Because the lesson is infinitely more important than the messenger's ego.
The lesson is a complete violent reversal of the human measure of status. Human nature looks at the wealthy leader, the CEO, the politician, and says, there is eminence. There is someone worthy of my time and attention.
Right.
The text looks at the blind man who has no money, no leverage, and no social capital, but who is hungry for truth and says, no, there is eminence. That is where true value resides.
The commentary explicitly states that the context here makes it clear that true eminence belongs to the virtuous, to the seeker of truth, not to the possessor of earthly power. The leaders who rejected the message, despite their wealth, would ultimately be abased, while the humble followers would be raised. It is a radical restructuring of the social hierarchy. It demands that we measure human worth entirely by internal desire for growth, rather than external ability or capital.
Let's translate this to our modern professional and social lives, because this hits uncomfortably close to home. How often, listener, are you at a conference, a networking event, or a party, and you are having a conversation with someone you deem unimportant?
We all do it.
And as they're talking to you, your eyes are darting over their shoulders, scanning the room to see if the director or the CEO or the person with 1 million followers has walked in.
We constantly dedicate our energy to people who, as the text brilliantly phrases it, consider themselves free from need. We chase the arrogant. We want proximity to power. And meanwhile, we divert ourselves from the people right in front of us who are earnestly striving. The junior employee asking for mentorship, the lonely neighbor, the person who actually wants to learn from us.
We treat the earnest seekers as interruptions to our grand strategic plans. So the question for you to mull over is, who is the blind man in your life? Who is the person lacking status who is actively seeking your time, your knowledge, or your friendship? And how can you actively pivot your attention away from the elites who don't care about you and redirect it toward the people who actually desire to grow? It requires abandoning the utilitarian calculus we use to navigate relationships.
It does. But, we have to acknowledge something very real here. Carrying this mindset, choosing the uphill road, fighting the societal obsession with wealth, constantly checking your own ego, pouring your energy into the marginalized, it takes a massive, sometimes unbearable psychological toll.
Oh, without a doubt. It leads to profound exhaustion. Which brings us to the psychological turning point of these chapters. What happens when the uphill road feels impossible to climb? What happens when the person trying to do the right thing completely burns out?
To explore this, we turn to chapter 93, titled The Early Hours, or Ad-Duha. The historical and emotional context provided in the commentary for this chapter is deeply moving. It was revealed after a terrifying pause in Revelation.
So the prophet had been receiving these intense, universe-shattering messages. He'd been thrust into this massive social conflict with the Quraysh. He was taking on all the stress, and then suddenly, silence.
A prolonged, agonizing period of total silence. No new verses, no guidance. The commentary notes that his opponents began to mock him, saying he had been forsaken, that his God had finally become displeased with him. You can imagine the profound psychological crisis.
Oh, yeah.
The anxiety, the self-doubt, the feeling of utter abandonment. It is the archetype of the dark night of the soul.
Anyone who has ever stepped out to do something difficult, only to hit a massive wall of failure or silence, knows that exact feeling. The imposter syndrome takes over. You think, I was wrong. I'm not cut out for this. The universe has abandoned me. And into that terrifying void, the text speaks with incredible tenderness.
It's a beautiful shift in tone.
It starts with oaths by time itself. Consider the early hours of the day and the night when it covers with darkness. And then it delivers the comfort. Your Lord has not forsaken you, nor has he become displeased.
What is truly fascinating here is the specific psychological methodology the text uses to comfort him. It doesn't just offer empty platitudes. It doesn't just say, cheer up, it will get better. It forces him into a rigorous exercise of remembering his own history of grace. It asks 3 rhetorical questions. Did he not find you an orphan and give you shelter? And find you unable to see the way and guide you? And find you in want and make you to be free from want?
It is demanding historical proof. It's saying, when your current reality is screaming that you are abandoned, look at the undeniable data of your own past. When you were a helpless orphan, did you stay abandoned? No, you found shelter. When you were completely lost and confused, did you stay lost? No, a path opened up. When you were impoverished, did you starve? No, you were sustained. It uses the concrete reality of past salvation to anchor the mind against the panic of present silence.
This directly links to the subsequent chapter, chapter 94, the expansion, or Al-Inshira. The text asks, have we not expanded for you your breast and taken off from you your burden, which almost broke your back?
Which almost broke your back. That is such an honest acknowledgement of the toll of leadership and empathy.
The commentary notes that this burden wasn't a physical weight, but the crushing emotional anxiety he felt for the state of humanity. The text acknowledges how close he came to breaking under the pressure. The concept of expanding the breast is a deeply evocative metaphor for relief, for courage, for illuminating the heart so that the lungs can take in air again. It is the antidote to the claustrophobia of anxiety.
If we translate this psychological framework for the listener navigating the 21st century, we are talking about a methodology for surviving burnout, deep anxiety, and depressive slumps. When you feel completely abandoned by your purpose, your industry, or your community, the ancient text suggests a 2-step recovery process.
Step 1 is that rigorous remembrance, forcing yourself to catalog the specific instances where you were lost, and somehow, against all odds, the path opened up. But step 2 is where the true genius of the text lies. It explicitly links this internal psychological healing with external outward service.
Right, because immediately after reminding him of the grace he received in the past, the text doesn't tell him to take a vacation. It gives him a directive. Therefore, as for the orphan, do not oppress him, and as for him who asks, do not chide him.
It is essentially saying, the cure for your feeling of abandonment is to become the agent of grace for someone else. You are an orphan who is sheltered, therefore you must be the shelter for the orphan. You are lost and seeking guidance, therefore do not yell at the beggar who asks you for help. You translate your gratitude for past survival into immediate action.
That is brilliant. True healing isn't just sitting in a dark room thinking about how healed you are. Healing is getting back on the uphill road. The anxiety breaks when you stop focusing entirely on your own internal void and start filling the void for someone else. So, here's a philosophical thought experiment for you. Think of a time when you were in your own pause of revelation, a devastating career slump, a bitter divorce, a period of deep anxiety where you felt completely stuck. Try to map out 3 distinct instances during that time where you were unable to see the way but were somehow guided. A mentor intervened, a random opportunity appeared, or you found a reserve of resilience you didn't know you possessed. Use that undeniable historical proof of grace in your own life to expand your chest in your current difficulties. And then complete the cycle. Find someone who is currently wandering in the dark and be the guide for them. Don't chide the person who is asking for help.
It creates a beautiful reciprocal cycle of grace that acts as the ultimate defense against the despair of the world. And honestly, this brings us to the climax of this entire collection of chapters. We've examined the cosmic warnings, the critique of systemic wealth, the interpersonal ethics of the defaulter, the reversal of status with the blind man, and the psychological comfort of the dark night. So what is the ultimate conclusion of this ancient wisdom?
We find that conclusion in Chapter 91, The Sun, which outlines the ultimate human binary, the evolution of the soul. The chapter begins with this massive, sweeping series of cosmic oaths. It swears by the sun and its brightness, the moon when it borrows light, the day when it exposes things, the night when it covers, the heaven and its construction, the earth and its expanse. It builds this incredible momentum of physical determinism.
Right, because all of those entities, the sun, the moon, the earth, they have no choice. They obey the physical laws of the universe perfectly. They do exactly what they were created to do without deviation. But then, after swearing by all these massive deterministic forces, the text focuses all of that cosmic weight onto one tiny, incredibly fragile, infinitely complex thing, the human soul.
And it states the ultimate, unavoidable truth about that soul. He will indeed be successful who purifies it, and he will indeed fail who corrupts it.
It establishes the absolute autonomy of the human self. Unlike the sun or the moon, the soul has a choice. The commentary explicitly states that this verse gives us a clear indication of the true condition of the mind. The faculties necessary for perfection, for empathy, for justice, they are given to every single human being. But they only thrive through active development. Corrupting the soul means indulging in the greed, the arrogance, and the defaulting that makes those higher faculties wither and fail. It is an active, daily choice. You are either working to scrub the rust off your heart, or you are allowing the rust to consume it entirely.
He will indeed be successful who purifies it. Let's talk about how radically countercultural that definition of success is. Modern culture has a completely different metric.
Completely different.
We are bombarded with messaging that tells us success is about expanding our footprint. It is returning to the exact warning of Chapter 102, the multiplication of wealth. Success is a bigger house, a larger audience, a thicker investment portfolio, a curated public image. We measure success by what we accumulate on the outside.
Yeah, we're obsessed with the external.
The text, radically, almost violently, asserts that all of that external accumulation is a mirage. It will not survive the quaking of the earth. The only success metric that actually matters, the only thing of substance you take with you, is internal purification. Have you cleared away the dross of your ego? Have you dismantled your urge to give a deficient measure to others? Have you learned to look at the blind man and see eminence?
And this internal purification isn't necessarily something that requires decades of grueling, joyless asceticism. As we synthesize this deep dive, we can look at Chapter 97, the Majesty, or Al-Qadr. It describes an incredible moment, the grand night, which it declares is better than 1,000 months.
Better than 1,000 months, over 80 years. That's a whole lifetime.
Exactly. The commentary suggests that this can be understood metaphorically as a time of profound spiritual awakening in the life of a human being. It is that singular moment when the divine light, or absolute truth, breaks through the darkness of human ignorance and ego.
I love that framing so much. It means you don't need 1,000 months of grinding, soulless hustle if you can achieve one night of true, purifying clarity. One moment of genuine realization about what actually matters in life is worth more than an entire lifetime spent blindly accumulating wealth. It connects right back to the blind man. He had that clarity in an instant, while the wealthy Quraysh leaders, with all their time and endless resources, lived their entire lives completely in the dark.
That clarity is available to anyone at any time if they're willing to walk the uphill road. But it demands letting go of the illusion of permanence. It demands stopping the deeply ingrained habit of defaulting on others. It requires recognizing the inherent dignity of every person regardless of their economic utility. And it requires remembering the grace that has sustained you through your own dark nights.
It is an incredibly demanding, entirely uncomfortable, but deeply beautiful way to view the world and our place in it. Which brings me to a final thought I want to leave you with. Something for you to mull over long after this deep dive ends. Earlier, we talked about Chapter 102, which carries that haunting warning, we are distracted by the multiplication of wealth until we visit the graves.
Yeah.
The obvious interpretation is that we chase money and status until we physically die, at which point it's all meaningless. But what if visiting the graves doesn't just mean physically dying at the end of your life? Think about it. What if visiting the graves also means looking at the dead ends of our own lives right now? What if the graves are the burned-out careers we sacrificed our health for? What if the graves are the broken marriages and lost friendships caused by our own greed and our demand for a full measure? What if the graves are the exhaustion and anxiety of constantly comparing our status to others?
That's a profound way to look at it.
What if we are currently standing in the graveyard of our own ambitions, and we need to realize that our relentless, unchecked pursuit of more is exactly what is making us hollow? What measure are you using for your life? And when the universe holds up a mirror, will that measure be a true one? That's the heart of this section. This is Wisdom for the Present, where understanding leads to clarity, and clarity shapes how we see and live. We'll see you in the next episode.